Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Student Conference Careers in Animal Law. We are joined by 5 panelists who have all chosen different and interesting career paths within animal law. I will start by introducing one of presenter at a time, and then they will explain their different career paths and give a brief introduction to their route, and then we will be followed by an opportunity to ask them questions. So I will start by introducing Alexandra Pester. Alexandra Pester is a criminal defense lawyer in Toronto and surrounding areas. A lawyer since 2018, Alexandra works with her small downtown Toronto firm as an associate. She believes wholeheartedly in the presumption of innocence and the rights enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Alexandra was a law student for the defense in R versus Kranjnik and was the co-counsel in R versus Kilimowicz. Her work with animal advocacy started much earlier, and she spent over a decade advocating for animals, including through her work with Mercy for Animals, PETA, Zoocheck Canada, and others. Take it away.
Thank you, Kaylee. Hi, everyone. So I'll sort of jump right into it and give you a bit of background about me and what got me where I am right now. I've been vegetarian since I was 15. I went vegan when I was 17. And around the same time, I moved to Ottawa to go to Carleton for my undergrad. I always, in my childhood and beyond, wanted a career that helped animals in some way. But when I realized that I'm not a science person, I kind of thought, okay, I don't know what that's going to be. I eventually in university watched a documentary that Leslie Bisgold was in. She was our first animal lawyer in Canada. And I thought to myself, like, I could maybe do law school. So that's what I did. I started doing sort of grassroots animal advocacy stuff in my undergrad. I spent summers and school breaks touring, doing leafleting tours with various organizations. And from there, I applied to law school and I went to Osgoode. Things are kind of different even then. I started in 2014. We had an animal law class on the books, but it didn't get taught because not enough people signed up. So I think things have changed a lot. There was a student animal legal defense fund chapter that I joined right away, and we had a solid group of people, but we were certainly a small group. I became president in my upper years. And throughout law school, I did volunteer work for organizations like Zoocheck, the Toronto Vegetarian Association, and other organizations whenever I could. And I ended up spending my first year of law school with Mercy for Animals in their legal department. Around second year, I started thinking long term, what is my career going to look like? How can I bring animals into that? And at the same time, I was getting interested in criminal law. So I started emailing around to criminal lawyers in Toronto, putting feelers out there. My criminal procedure professor at the time was Gary Grill, who ended up hiring me to assist him and his co-counsel James Silver with Anita Krines's mischief case. So I spent my second year summer doing that. I was then hired by James as his articling student. James is vegan, he's an animal guy, and that opened a lot of doors to doing this kind of work. During my articling, he sent me to PETA's legal department for a couple of weeks. And after articling, I stayed on with James and his law partner, Susan Pennypacker, and I've been an associate with them for 3 years now. My job is not all representing animal activists. We represent people charged with anything from all kinds of walks of life, but representing activists is definitely a big part of what we do. What is great about my job is that there's never a dull moment. It is always interesting and it is always challenging. And you get to represent the underdog every day. I think a lot of us can relate to the desire to represent the underdog. So it fits. We've got to do countless activist cases in my firm, like the ones that Kaylee mentioned, but there are a lot that don't make media like that. There is a lot of activist defense work out there, and it seems to be growing, and it can be a part of your practice if you want it to be. Criminal defense in general, it's a really good way to get yourself into court a lot. You get to work with and for really interesting people, and you get to feel like you're fighting the good fight, and you get to do that often. So my advice to law students is that it's important to do work during your studies to assist organizations and get your name out there. and the opportunities, they do seem to be much more than they were many years ago, but it's important to get your name out there because we're still a pretty small community doing this work. And I would also say that you shouldn't hesitate to reach out to anyone at the conference who are doing jobs that you think are interesting or studying things you think are interesting. I think anyone here would be really happy to have those conversations with people. So I think that's sort of it about me. And I look forward to questions. Thanks, Kaylee.
Awesome. Okay, so Marty Mckendree is a lawyer and parliamentary advisor to two senators, the Honorable Pierre Delfond and the Honorable Marty Klein. He previously worked with former Senator Murray Sinclair to draft and introduce Bill S-218, the Jane Goodall Act, now sponsored by Senator Klein. He also worked with former Senator Wilfred Moore to draft and advance Bill S-203, the Ending of Captivity of Whales and Dolphins Act, now law. As well, Marty worked to advance many successful animal welfare and environmental protection bills in the 42nd Parliament as Director of Parliamentary Affairs to the government representative in the newly independent Senate. These bills included S-84, Animal Fighting and Abuse, S-68, Fish Habitat Protection and Shark Fin Ban, and C-55, that was C-68, C-84, and C-55, Marine Protected Areas Expansion. In the 43rd Parliament, Marty worked to support the passage of Bill C-12 towards net zero carbon emissions in Canada by the year 2050. All right, take it away, Marty.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Animal Justice for organizing and to all the students tuning in, as well as co-panelists. As Kaylee mentioned, my legal career has been as a parliamentary advisor. I've been fortunate that this work has often focused on animal law as well as environmental protection. For me, working in Parliament has really been a dream job. I've loved every minute of helping to develop and advance animal policy for office holders. And when I was in law school, I was really not aware of this career option, and I hope that that is changing along with a greater interest in animal law. And really the best thing about the field to me is the opportunity to make a difference. In law school, I found the discussion of changing the law focused on litigation, whereas legislation is also a huge field with tons of room for creativity and innovation. As well, advisory positions such as mine are much more common than you would think. There's roles available, for example, in the House of Commons, the Independent Senate, the mostly independent Senate, I should say, provincial and territorial legislatures, municipal legislatures, Indigenous governments, and non-governmental organizations like Animal Justice and Humane Canada. Some roles are partisan, such as if you're working for an MP or a cabinet minister. However, many roles are nonpartisan, though still political, such as in the Senate, or if you were working for a city councilor, say. There are also related roles in the public service, such as in legislative drafting. Of course, it's an open question whether any such role may touch on animal law and to what degree, and that depends really on the office holder. So if you are looking to pursue an animal focus, you should identify office holders with an interest in the topic. For example, Animal Justice, I know, has highlighted 23 animal-friendly MPs. In these roles, you should also expect to work on many legislative subjects. Like you would also be working on whatever other bills are going through Parliament generally. So being a policy generalist with a wide range of skills is ideal. And for example, useful skills include legal research, speech writing, procedural ability, media relations, and Twitter. I'd actually put a bit of emphasis on procedural ability because there's very few people you realize with deep knowledge of legislative procedure. So if somebody's willing to learn that specialized area, it really gives you a huge advantage. I'll turn now a bit to my career path to give a sense of how to break into the political and policy development field. So my interest in animal law started with my lifelong passion for animals, particularly conserving wildlife. And when I was a kid, I wanted to be a zoologist or a marine biologist. And I always maintained this interest, but studied philosophy and went to law school without really having any kind of clear future in mind. I'm sure that's the case for many people. So at the University of Toronto Law School, I was one of only 8 students in our class to take animal law, along with Camille Labchuk, who many will know. From there, I articled at Stikeman Elliott in Ottawa in regulatory law. This was a very useful experience in honing my ability to write good memos and learning from the examples of leading professionals. But I always had a huge interest in politics, being someone who was pretty much an Obama fanatic and not a huge fan of the Harper government. So living in Ottawa, I decided to work in federal politics, looking ahead to the 2015 federal election. With that goal in mind, I went to work in the Senate, then the House of Commons, and on Prime Minister Trudeau's 2015 campaign, then back to the Senate to help implement the policy of an independent upper chamber. For anyone trying to get a foot in the door, volunteering for an office holder or organization is probably the easiest way to get involved, including while you're in school. This is how I did it, and legal education is a huge advantage because all legislation has a legal aspect. My work in animal law really got going when Senator Wilfred Moore was interested to take on the issue of whale captivity, and this being around the time when blackfish and marine land were in the news all the time. I worked with him to draft the bill, and from then on, though we would never in a million years have guessed it, we had embarked on the longest successful legislative battle in Canadian history at nearly 4 years until the bill passed in 2019. And now the law is a major statutory precedent for animals. For much of that time, I worked for the government Senate office to manage the government legislative agenda at the staff level. This included work on over 80 government bills, such as cannabis legalization, measures around reconciliation, animal abuse, and many environmental bills, such as for marine and freshwater protection. And I always sort of, tried to work closely on the environmental bills because that was a big interest of mine. And in fact, it was Senate government amendments that enabled the whale bill to pass and also implemented the shark fin ban. After that role, I was excited to work for independent senators who are free to initiate policies. And I was honored to next work for both Senator Murray Sinclair, a former judge and chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and Senator Pierre Dalphond, who's a former judge of the Quebec Court of Appeal. This work focused on Senate reform, and with Senator Dalphond has focused on Senate reform, reconciliation, and environmental protection. And in the case of Senator Sinclair, helping to formulate his sequel to the whale bill, which is now titled the Goodall Act. That bill, now sponsored by Senator Klein, would create perhaps the strongest animal protection law in the world by extending animal cruelty and international trade protections to captive elephants, great apes, and non-domesticated species, such as big cats, as well as creating limited legal standing for these species in criminal sentencing, and banning elephant ivory and hunting trophies. The Goodall Act is currently a focus of my work in the Progressive Senate group. The bill is also a personal passion, which I talk about frequently, or maybe all the time, so I don't really see my job as a job in a sense. In closing, while in law school, I really wouldn't have imagined a job like mine even existed. I would encourage you to be inspired, to follow your passion, to set attainable goals, and to never give up. The whale bill is an initiative actually that was sort of mocked and disparaged by some upon its introduction, and Senator Moore and others were told, it would never become law. But it became law despite all odds. And measures in the Goodall Act even made it into the governing party's platform this election, raising the prospects of success. So I encourage you to join the legislative fight to help save animals and the environment at the staff level, or perhaps some of you may even want to stand for public office. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Angela Lee is an assistant professor at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law at X University. She received her JD from Peter Allard School of Law at UBC and her PhD from the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law. She has previously co-developed and co-taught food law at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law and taught animals in the law at the Dalhousie University Schulich School of Law in the winter 2020 term. She is a co-editor of Food Law and Policy in Canada and her research on topics relating to animals, food, technology, the environment, and feminism have been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including the Animal Law Review, Canadian Food Studies, the Canadian Journal of Women and the Law, and the Windsor Review of Legal and Social Issues. Take it away, Angela.
Great, thank you so much, Haley. It's been really interesting and illuminating to listen to my fellow panelists speak, because even though we are working in different areas, I think there are some common themes that emerge and that we can trace through each of our journeys. So we were asked to reflect on a number of questions in preparing our remarks, including how I became interested in animal law, how my law school experience set me up for my career, and what my career is and how I contribute to animal law in Canada. So I went to law school at UBC, like Haley mentioned. I didn't graduate too long ago. I graduated in 2015. And even then, animal law still wasn't nearly as developed in Canada as it is now, or as it is in the United States or in other jurisdictions. So I wasn't even aware that animal law was a separate area of study and practice. There wasn't a course in animal law that I could have taken as a law student. And so it is really encouraging to see such interest, such sustained interest on the part of students. And there's a real appetite for this type of stuff, not just in law school, but also in careers and being able to pursue a career in this area. So all of that is really nice for me to see. But I do want to make very clear that I certainly did not expect when I was entering law school, or even when I was graduating, that I would end up what I was doing today. I didn't know any professors. I didn't even know what it meant to be a professor or an academic. And I certainly didn't expect to be able to research and write on issues relating to animals and food and all of these other things that I'm super passionate about. So I went to law school thinking that I was going to be a public interest environmental lawyer. So my interest in animal related issues really stems from my interest in environmental concerns and also my interest in food. So this is something that I started to delve into a lot more when I was in grad school. So I wrote a research paper that's now published on in vitro meat and the implications of these new forms of technology and innovation in the food space and what this means for animals. Since obviously animals farmed for food is a significant problematic area when it comes to animal welfare considerations as a whole. So that was kind of my entry point into animal law related issues. And as far as how my law school experience set me up for my career, I would say that it probably didn't in a direct way. So like I said, I didn't take a course in animal law. There wasn't one that was offered. And so while it did set me up to be an academic in many ways, it didn't necessarily set me up to be an academic that focuses on animal law. So I did research work for both of my summers, my 1L and my 2L summers, with professors, which I think was really valuable. And so if academia is something that you're interested in, I would certainly say that getting that kind of experience doing research work with a professor, whether or not it's related to animal law or tangential issues, is something that I would encourage you to do. It's really useful as an academic. Reading and writing are basically your bread and butter. And the more opportunities you have to do that, especially in a structured setting with guidance from someone who is more well-versed in these types of issues and can answer questions you have, is really valuable. And there are probably, I would say, about 10 professors that I can think of right now whose scholarship or teaching touches on animal law in some way in Canada. So if this is something that you're interested in, I would even encourage you to reach out to them, even if they're not at the school that you're attending. So the three things that I would offer to kind of sum up and conclude here, and again, kind of echoing things that my other panelists have said, one is to be proactive. So it is really to your benefit to seek out opportunities and not just expect that they're going to fall into your lap. So even opportunities like this conference that's now become an annual event is a really great opportunity for you to network with people who are working in the field and who are researching on a number of different topics that you might be interested in learning more about. The second thing is not to rule anything out. So there are a lot of surprises and twists and turns that can come up in your career. It could take a direction that you never foresaw, and often this is very positive. And then the last thing is just to trust the journey. These are often not linear things, your career path. It can often go in a number of different directions before you really settle into something that is right for you and that is right for your skill set and your interests and your values and so on. And sometimes it might not feel like you're making a ton of forward progress, or the end point is unclear. And I would say to just kind of keep going, trust in the process, learn as much as you can. And so, yeah, I look forward to answering any questions that you might have during the Q&A, but I will end this now.
Sophie Gillard joined the Montreal SPCA in 2013 after having graduated from McGill University's Faculty of Law and articling at the Crown Prosecutor's Office in Montreal. In her role as Director of Animal Advocacy and Legal Affairs, she oversees the Montreal SPCA's efforts to strengthen animal protection legislation and public policy at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels. She is namely one of the instigators of the Animals Are Not Things Manifesto, which led to the adoption of a new provision in the Civil Code of Quebec, recognizing animals as sentient beings. Take it away, Sophie.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, students, co-panelists, and organizers. So to give you a little bit of background of how I ended up at the SPCA, I was actually, I've been involved in animal protection in some way or another since I was a little kid, always interested in animal protection, activism, etc. Never thinking I could actually make it into a career. So I ended up doing my undergrad in linguistics, then a graduate degree in speech language pathology, became a speech language pathologist, worked at a hospital. I thought that was going to be my career, but I kept sort of having this nagging feeling of like, this is not actually 100% what I want to be doing with my life. How can I somehow work to improve the lives of animals and actually make a living doing it? And I happened across, so I was kind of soul searching, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, asking myself existential questions. And I happened across the website of the Animal Legal Defense Fund in the US and had sort of a light bulb moment and thought, hey, this is what I could do. I could go back to school and become an animal lawyer. So kind of naively, I have to say, without really looking into how many actual opportunities or jobs there were in Canada before embarking on this like 4-year journey, I decided to use up all my savings and go back to law school, which I really enjoyed. And in law school, I really took every opportunity I could to sort of work animals into whatever else I was working on. So we didn't have the chance to have an animal law class at the time at McGill, but a group of us that were interested in animal law managed to put together a student-run seminar having to do with animal law. So I was involved in that. And basically, you know, in every other class, every paper I got to write, I would somehow try to work animals into the equation. And in terms of extracurriculars, we had the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter at McGill. So I was involved in that, became president for a couple of years as well. And also attended conferences at the time. Of course, this wonderful conference didn't exist. And so we had to go to the US to go to attend an animal law conference. So I did that for throughout law school. I also took every opportunity I could to volunteer and do internships. So I actually interned at Animal Justice back in the day when it was called Lawyers for Animal Welfare, the wonderful acronym LAW, which they ended up changing. I also interned at the Animal Legal Defense Fund in California, as well as the Montreal SPCA. And that's where I met someone who would become my mentor, Alana Devine, who was a director of advocacy at the time. And then I did bar school and did my official articling for the Quebec Bar at the Crown Prosecutor's Office, sort of basically just kind of hoping something would come along, I would get some kind of job offer. And luckily enough, Alana at the Montreal SPCA ended up being able to secure a budget to hire me. And so I came on as a lawyer for the advocacy department and for also the cruelty investigations team. So I can tell you a little bit about that work, about the enforcement work, which I'm no longer currently involved in because I've been now for 8 years at the Spca. I became director of advocacy I think 3 or 4 years ago. And very recently, we decided to split off the cruelty investigations department. So I'm no longer involved in that and doing full-time advocacy and legal affairs. But I'll tell you still a little bit about the enforcement side of things because it's pretty cool. But I'll start with telling you what I currently do. So right now I'm responsible for overseeing all the SPCA's efforts to strengthen animal protection legislation at all provincial and municipal levels. So basically what we do is comment on bills, on draft regulations, testify at the National Assembly whenever there is any bill that has to do with animal protection that is introduced. We also work with political parties to try to get animals onto their platforms. And we develop and oversee public pressure campaigns targeting legislative changes or public policy changes. So for example, in my bio, I mentioned, well, Kaylee mentioned the Animals Are Not Things Manifesto. So that was a really cool project we worked on in order to basically pressure the Quebec government to review animals' legal status in the Civil Code of Quebec. And it led to the introduction of a bill and the enactment of a new provision in the Civil Code. So that was exciting. I also act as a spokesperson for the SPCA in the media whenever there's anything to do with animal protection issues or animal law issues. I'm the one who responds to media requests. And I think if I have the time, I can give you just a quick overview too of the enforcement aspect, which, as I said, I'm no longer directly involved in, but that I was involved in for several years. So at the SPCA, like in many other SPCAs, we employ special constables who have the power to enforce the animal cruelty and neglect provisions of the criminal code, and also who can apply the provincial animal welfare legislation in Quebec. And so one of my responsibilities was to oversee that entire department, ensure that everything was running smoothly when it came to enforcement, dealing with how do we deal with seized animals, and sometimes they're dogs or cats, other times they're horses, occasionally lions. So that's a whole exciting area. And another aspect of that role was also to act as a resource person for Crown and police all over the province. Basically, I was the go-to person when police came across an animal cruelty or neglect case. They would call me up. Crown would come to me to obtain jurisprudence on animal cruelty and neglect. So that was my role in the enforcement side of things. And to conclude, just a couple pieces of advice, if there's any bits of wisdom I can impart upon you. And it's basically a lot of things that have already been said, but I'll repeat them nonetheless. So for me, it was really, the way I see things in retrospect, I managed to get my job doing full-time animal advocacy because I basically paved the way for myself. You really have to, I think, in this field, create opportunities for yourself, carve your own path. There's no real recipe of you do this and this and this, and you'll end up with a career in animal law. You just have to be creative and seize opportunities and create something for yourself. Another thing that came up and that I'll repeat because I think it warrants emphasis is the importance of networking and making contacts. It's still a relatively small field. We pretty much all know each other. And so you want to get your name out there. You want to take opportunities to volunteer whenever you can, reach out to academics, reach out to organizations, nonprofits, and attend conferences and really talk to people. And final piece of advice, don't despair. There are not that many jobs doing full-time animal law work in Canada yet, but there are a ton of ways that you can work animals into any legal career, in my opinion, and I've seen people do it. So I think it's important to sort of tell yourselves that if you don't manage to secure your dream job doing full-time animal work right off the bat, you'll nevertheless be able to make a meaningful contribution regardless of which job you end up doing, at least for now. That's it. Thank you.
Scott Tinney is a staff lawyer at Animal Justice based in Toronto, Ontario. He is working to oppose agricultural egg gag legislation in various jurisdictions across Canada, including by way of constitutional challenge in Ontario. Scott's work also includes regularly prepping complaints and submissions to provincial and federal animal welfare authorities, assisting with ongoing and planned legal challenges involving animal protection law, constitutional law, and human rights law, and assisting with Animal Justice's various law reform campaigns. Scott graduated from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law in 2018 after completing his undergraduate degree in political studies at Queen's University in 2015. Take it away, Scott.
Thanks, Kaylee, and thanks to everybody else here. I think this has been a pretty, I apologize in advance for any overlap, but I think it's been a pretty thorough overview, and I've been interested to hear everybody's paths because obviously, like everyone's saying, it's not linear. There's 100 different ways to get to this end goal. So hopefully my career journey will be of some help or comfort or interesting at the very least. So I'll walk through the same kind of questions everybody else has gone through. So the first question that we were asked to kind of address is how we became interested in animal law. I think like most people, I had a general interest dating back to before high school, throughout high school, in my undergraduate degree, trying to use poli-sci to affect change when I could and get involved with groups, and then into law school. It wasn't really until I met my partner, who works at as a wildlife rehabilitator at the Toronto Wildlife Center, that things kind of accelerated for me, and I had a fire lit under me that I really wanted to get involved and try to make a difference and use my law degree to affect change in something that I was passionate about. So ultimately, this long-standing interest kind of became a goal of mine in first year law or late in my undergrad, and I started to think about how I could possibly maneuver my way into the field. So stemming from that, I kind of tried to get involved in as many extracurriculars, working groups as possible at law school to try to just get immersed in the field, learn about it, and kind of get the ear of the small community that animal rights and animal welfare law really is. I got involved in a working group with Professor Angela Fernandez at U of T, who is a speaker at this conference and a board member with Animal Justice. I joined our Student Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter, our Animal Justice Club, and helped to chair the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund. Basically just took every excuse I possibly could. Obviously, animal law, there aren't a million clubs at your law school that you can join, but whatever I could join, I would try to jump in there. And there were some really cool opportunities. I remember a couple friends of mine who were with the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund as well actually got to go to the Supreme Court on the DLW case that Animal Justice argued. I don't know what I was doing that weekend when they went or whenever it was argued, but I didn't end up going, but they got to go firsthand, which I kick myself for not doing. But really cool opportunities, obviously, just kind of getting your name out there and getting involved in the community. So as time went on, the more I learned about it, I progressed through law school and kind of better grasped how I could use my law degree in the future to get involved in the area. I kind of became more invested in it. Obviously, it's a very novel area of the law and it's very underdeveloped. So I liked the opportunity to be creative in it. Like the fact that you could kind of be a trailblazer, and like hearing all the panelists before, everybody's kind of introducing these novel and groundbreaking pieces of legislation or working on cases that become kind of canon in Canada. I really love the idea of kind of being involved in that. And I got very, very interested in it, and I'm still very interested in it to this day, obviously. So I guess the second question is how my law school experience set me up for my career. I don't necessarily have, it wasn't necessarily perfectly tailored to it. I think generally speaking, legal writing, legal research is obviously an asset in any career you pursue, particularly as a lawyer. But kind of just it helped me understand strategies and ways that I could get involved, kind of career paths and yeah, other methods that I could learn and become a competent legal scholar, I suppose. More specifically, obviously getting involved in these working groups, these clubs, meeting people, whether it be like-minded students or professors or practitioners in the field who would come to speak with us, kind of meeting them and getting involved in that small network, I thought was a big asset. And some of those connections still persist to this day and kind of helped me land this job that I got with Animal Justice as a staff lawyer. So that's the last question. I guess it stems into that. What is my career and how do I contribute to animal law in Canada? So I guess I'll answer this in two parts. First, my career is a staff lawyer with Animal Justice. I've been with Animal Justice for just a year now, I guess just under a year. But I get to work on a variety of things, which are incredibly interesting. And I feel very, very fortunate to have gotten this role. So among other things, we work on a lot of regulatory complaints and deal with a lot of government agencies regarding the conduct of the agricultural sector, for example, zoos, aquariums, even individuals who might potentially be subject of an animal cruelty case, something like that. So we get to work with a lot of people who are on this panel and beyond, who we kind of have a lot of overlap, and it's really collaborative and great. And I find that area very interesting. We do a lot of law reform campaigns, whether that be, for example, currently like the fur farm ban is of big importance to animal justice with the COVID outbreaks and all these mink farms, working on policies with pesticides, cosmetic testing, and specifically campaigns to certain legislation, whether it be the Jane Goodall Act, consultations with regard to elephant ivory, et cetera. We really get to comment on the effectiveness of law and try to push for stronger laws and attempt to use them. We obviously have litigation as well, where we get to intervene in a variety of cases. We were recently in the Alberta Court of Appeal in the Chen case, and we have intervened in we are intervening in a Supreme Court case right now on public interest standing, which is very, very interesting. And beyond that, we have a constitutional challenge going with regard to ag law, and there's more on the horizon that we think we could potentially work on. So all this to say, it's an amazing opportunity. I love it, and I'm so lucky to have had it, and I love being able to meaningfully contribute every day. But I think the second part that I wanted to highlight is that my path to this job wasn't necessarily what you'd expect. It's not necessarily conventional. So coming out of law school, and I'm sure a lot of you feel as students feel this, the pressure during OCIs and to get like a traditional law job, to work on Bay Street, to grind and pay down your student debts and this, that, and the other. Obviously, it's easy to get caught up in that. And that's something, despite my interest in animal law and despite my desire to do it throughout law school, I obviously got caught up in. I worked at a good firm. I enjoyed the people I worked with and the work I did. I was a commercial real estate lawyer over less than 2 years ago. I was a commercial real estate lawyer. But again, doing that I wasn't necessarily passionate about it, and it didn't really click. I know it's very cliche, but it was something that I wanted to pivot from, and yeah, and was lucky enough to do so. So I just wanted to highlight this just because it's kind of a totally viable option to jump into one of these larger full service firms and then transition, or even a small boutique firm, or start in-house or start in academia and transfer over. There's no one path. It's not linear, like everybody's been saying. And I think there's benefits to working in any area before coming into animal law, whether it be this larger firm or something else. I mean, I got like a lot of legal research and writing skills. I got to deal with a lot of personalities, which I think was important, and dealing with a lot of personalities on a day-to-day basis, obviously meeting with a lot of politicians and like-minded individuals, organizations, et cetera. So I think there is value certainly in alternative paths, and I just want that to be kind of a comfort to people that you're not necessarily going to get your foot in the door immediately, but have faith and remain passionate and immersed and involved in the field. So yeah, I guess that's my advice as well. Just basically follow your passion, stay immersed in it, keep doors open, and kind of let your interests be known, but don't worry if things aren't immediately clicking. I suppose there are several paths to the same end. So yeah, be creative and persistent, and keep into it. And I guess that's all I have to say. Sorry if I went over time.
No worries. Okay, so we don't have any questions right now in the Q&A. So if anyone has any questions for this wonderful group of panelists, please ask them, and then I can forward them on to the group. But in the meantime, I have a few questions that I would like to ask you guys. So I wanted to ask a general question going back to law school. If you can return yourselves to there. If you could give an advice to your law school self, what would you say? And we can go in the order of speaking. So we can start with Alexandra and then go down as everyone had introduced themselves. So I'm in my last year of law school, and I would really appreciate some advice to finish up on a good note and also get out of there alive. So I'm really looking forward to what you guys have to say. We'll start with Alexandra.
I think I just have to echo some of the things that some of my co-panelists said. I think when you're interested in animal work, it can be very stressful to envision your career when you're looking at the options that are out there. It can be really difficult looking for an articling job and thinking like, well, I'm never going to get to help animals. Like there's nothing out there for me. You have to be creative and and you have to be open-minded. Like I didn't expect to be a criminal defense lawyer for this long. I thought maybe I'd article and then leave, but it ended up being something that I've really enjoyed. And it's been a way that I can help animals through advocating for the people that advocate for them. And so that's what I'd say. I think just don't let yourself get overwhelmed by what seems to be a shortage of opportunity, and you have to carve your own path, like Sophie said, and yeah, just to again emphasize, meet people, get your name out there, feel free to cold email random people you've never met, and it can turn into something. So that would be my advice on that.
Thanks for the question. I guess I would have a few tips if I was talking to myself in law school. I would say one thing is some people have gone into law school not having worked between undergrad and law school. And once you have worked, you may look back fondly on law school as like an enjoyable chance to learn and discuss interesting topics. So I would encourage people to try to see it that way now, even if you haven't worked. Like it's kind of enjoyable and interesting to be able to take classes and talk about abstract ideas. And a lot of people at law school spend a lot of time like stressing about OCIs and such. And in hindsight, you will have missed an opportunity to have like this, you know, I mean, there's a bit of that is bound to be in there, but just try to enjoy it and see it as like an opportunity to learn. And if you take things you like, you're likely to do well in those. And then another thing would be, as many have commented, there's no real like linear way to become involved in animal law, or there aren't that many. So I wouldn't get worried too much if you end up doing something else that's even totally different, like for a while. I mean, if you do anything where you can become a skilled professional, that will be valuable once you eventually find your way into law school. So if you're doing something into animal law or partially into animal law, so if you're doing something unrelated but don't despair if your dream is to be an animal law. Just try to do a good job at whatever you're doing and become, a well-experienced person. And a final practical tip would be if anyone is interested in doing sort of legislative work, the two most relevant courses are probably constitutional law and administrative law. And there's a lot of discussion, for example, of what's in the federal jurisdiction or what's in the provincial jurisdiction. So that's a useful skill to have if you're thinking about what courses to take. Thank you.
So my advice is quite similar to Marty's in that it really boils down to try to take classes that you are actually interested in and that you think that you are more likely to enjoy, as opposed to trying to build your classes around strategic considerations about what's going to be tested on the bar exam or what are employers going to like to see as my intended courses during OCIs. For practical reasons, in that your performance in classes generally tends to be better if you are interested in the material. And also this is a real opportunity to delve into issues that you might not have had a chance to think about in such a structured and rigorous format otherwise. This is advice that I wish that I had taken when I was in law school. In a great irony, I actually did not enjoy law school at all. And I think part of the reason for that is because I just never wanted to be on campus. And so I really structured my course schedule around trying to get everything out of the way on like 2 days of the week so that I never had to commute in. This is a terrible idea. I just didn't enjoy many of my classes. I was looking through some of my law school materials the other day, and I had taken a course in creditors' remedies, and I must have been in a fugue state the whole time, because if you told me now to tell you something about creditors' remedies, I honestly would not be able to offer anything remotely useful. So obviously it's not entirely practical to, or pragmatic to think that your course schedule is going to be full of things that you love and that you feel really enthusiastic about. I do think that it is a good idea to try to at least get some classes in there that you are passionate about, you're excited about doing the readings, instead of feeling like you're just dragging yourself to class every day and putting yourself through this for some other ancillary purpose.
It's getting really tricky not to repeat what others have said. But I think like sort of to build on the last comments about sort of enjoying law school, I think taking your time, if you're at all possible, to sort of stretch it out somehow. I did my law school over 4 years, and I was really happy to have done that. It allowed me to enjoy my classes more, I had to be less sort of pragmatic, as Angela said, about like making sure my schedule was nice, because I had fewer hours, but it also allowed me the time to get involved in all the extracurriculars, do internships, do volunteer work, and that ended up being just as useful to me as my grades that I got in my classes. So I think if you're at all able to take the time, and then I'm trying to be creative here, not to repeat what people have said, but I think if you're involved, if you're interested in litigation at all, go to court, because I found that I actually, like during all of law school, I never once went to court and actually saw, how all this goes down. And it's so different than what, from sitting in a class and hearing about, the criminal law versus sitting in a courtroom and actually seeing it happen, and sort of seeing like the volume and all the sort of the negotiations and all the things, the plea deals that you don't hear so much about in school. I kind of regret not having done that more, and I feel I would have gotten a lot more out of my classes, sort of knowing the reality of the courtroom, and it would also have helped me in terms of articling, I think, if I had been a little bit more familiar with that. That's it.
I'm a lot like Sophie in that I don't have a lot of novel advice to offer, given that everybody has already given some very quality advice. So I will do my best not to overlap as well. Yeah, I think this has been said by everybody in some way. They've touched on this. Just trying to be less concerned about appearing marketable and more concerned about kind of personal interest. I did not follow this advice personally as a student. I remember taking like secured transactions because like, oh, that would be great for a corporate job, and this, that, and the other that I thought would be very applicable to this kind of a more traditional law career. I wasn't necessarily interested in them at all. I wasn't interested in them at all, in a lot of those courses at all. So I would just say, try to take whatever excites you, and things will materialize from there. So I guess stemming to that is kind of just going with the flow. Things won't always necessarily work out the way you expect or want them to. You won't always land that first great job. You won't always end up in exactly the situation you want. I would just take whatever you can from whatever situation you're in. Take from it what you can. There's always positives. You can learn a lot of practice points in any situation. And kind of reapply those to whatever future career you want to end up in. And then lastly, kind of more than anything, being pragmatic and putting yourself out there. I think more than the subject matter I learned in law school, the connections have kind of paid dividends towards the end, knowing a lot of people, even my peers who are now in practicing interesting areas of the law, whether they be in-house or in private practice or elsewhere. They have been assets, and same with professors and other colleagues I've reached out to when I was younger. Those are kind of lifelong connections, and I think they're super valuable, especially when you're trying to break into a niche field. So don't hesitate to reach out to somebody whose work you think is interesting. Like Ali said, it's yeah, I don't think the person will receive you with any hostility. They'll be happy to walk you through it, right? So yeah, reach out. Don't second guess it. That's all I have.
Awesome. Okay, so I have another general question for you guys. What are some of the biggest challenges in regards to animal advocacy that you've had to face in your role in your particular career so far? And then we'll go in order of presentation again.
Okay, so in criminal law, it's a tough area to try to make change for animals as a defense lawyer. And for example, telling the court that animals are not property under the criminal code. Nobody has accepted that, right? The courts are not accepting that from us as criminal lawyers, and that's to be expected. So when you're doing criminal defense work, it's sort of oftentimes your impact can feel limited to the case that you're representing, and the effects of some of our cases have been bigger than just what happens to our client, but yeah, it can feel sort of like, okay, well, we can make these arguments, but ultimately they're not going to go anywhere. What is usually more successful is standard criminal defenses. But I think it's still important, and it's a good way to support people that are doing really big picture work when they run into issues with the law. So I guess that's what I would say about that. There are definitely other challenges associated with doing criminal defense work, but as it relates to sort of the animal law piece, that's what I would say about that.
Thank you for this question as well. In terms of, I would say the biggest challenge around pursuing animal issues sort of in the political sphere is they're less so now, but in the past there have been from some quarters notions that animal issues are like a non-serious issue, or that they are activist driven and activist focused, and that's sort of a way of minimizing the subject of law and of portraying policy initiatives as fringe or unrealistic or not based in serious policy. And I think that has changed a lot recently. And to use the whale bill as an example, there were some sort of attempts, including from some involved in the captivity industry, to portray the bill as such. And the main thing I would say that pushes back on that and carries tons of weight in Parliament is science. So like science is way ahead of actual animal policy. So to use the whale bill as an example, having tons of marine biologists and real well respected scientific experts underpinning the animal policy, that was like a game changer, because you can't dismiss expert scientists. And now that that carries through to the Jane Goodall bill, but I think it would have application in any animal policy. You want to be able to make the moral case or the legal case or the political case, but it's also important to have, I would say, a scientific case underpinning whatever it is you are pursuing. And I also think the sort of disparaging attitudes towards animal policy as activism have changed, particularly through the leadership of Senator Moore and Senator Sinclair. There's been tons of Indigenous leadership in the Senate on animal issues, and Senator Sinclair is very clear that this is a serious policy issue. And this election, Animal Justice hosted a debate with at least 3 MPs on animal policies in the election. So this is the first time it's sort of made it into the mainstream electoral debate. And the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, and the NDP all had substantive animal welfare policies. So I think things have changed a lot recently, and it's becoming regarded as just a policy as serious and important as others.
So I don't know if this question is as directly relevant to me. Some of the challenges that I'm going to be talking about are just kind of endemic to academia in general, regardless of the kind of work that you're doing. But the academic job market is extremely fickle. So it's not just a matter of the merits of your scholarship, your research or whatever, but you want to make sure that you are a well-rounded candidate in many ways, that you demonstrate that you can teach not just classes and things like animal law or more specialized subject matter, but that you're also versed in other kind of core areas of the curriculum, whether this is first year classes or upper year classes that are generally quite important and popular, like family law, for example. So there aren't really many people who I would consider to be purely animal law scholars, especially in Canada. Most people who do animal law scholarship have some other kind of doctrinal area or theoretical perspective or framework that they tie in, and that applies not just to their analysis of animal related issues, but also to their research and teaching and scholarly work more generally. So this is certainly not limited to any one area. There are people who are animal law scholars who are experts in criminal law, experts in family law, experts in admin, constitutional. So it doesn't necessarily have to be one particular thing, but it is good to ensure that you are being more broadly marketable than just pinning yourself as I do animal law and this is all that I'm willing to do.
So I wrote down 3 points that I think are my 3 main challenges in life as an animal advocate at the SPCA. First of all, and I agree with Marty that this is getting better, but being taken seriously is still sometimes difficult when you're defending animals. I think increasingly, you know, in the context of with legal professionals and in academia, it's certainly being taken more seriously. In the media, it can still be an uphill battle to sort of have your considerations be taken seriously. So that's always really annoying. Second point is not getting discouraged slash depressed because it is a pretty depressing field to work in. I don't know if my co-panelists agree, but I mean, the amount of, you know, suffering we're faced with on a daily basis, the sheer magnitude of it, the fact that it's still not like, you know, a matter of social consensus that this really needs to change, you know, drastically, I think makes it really hard. And, you know, we have, at least in my work, and maybe it's just because I'm not that good at my job, but very few victories. You know, the day that you can actually obtain a legislative change for animals that's meaningful, that's really something to celebrate, because a lot of the time we're doing a whole lot of asking and a whole lot of campaigning and a whole lot of work for it to actually not go anywhere. You know, and, you know, some of the bills and regulations that I've been commenting on for years and years and repeating the same thing and just like copying and pasting my comments, it can get a little bit discouraging. So I think that's difficult, and it's really important to sort of combat that, to have a good team of people that either you work with, that are your direct colleagues, or other people that are in the movement that you can sort of commiserate with, and that can sort of cheer you up when you're feeling down, and also really important to celebrate any small victory, because they're few and far between in this field. And last point, working with limited resources. I'm sure this is a reality for other people working in other nonprofits. But, you know, I deal with people who have, you know, secretaries and access to legal databases, and I have nothing. Do all my own emails, all my own filing, you know, so sometimes it can get a little bit difficult. But disheartening to see, you know, that, you know, what you can actually achieve is also limited by the financial means of your organization. So yeah, those are my 3 top challenges.
I once again have a little bit of overlap, particularly with Sophie's points towards the end there. I think the biggest challenge I've found so far is kind of getting through or getting used to kind of spinning your wheels on issues and not necessarily making making tangible progress. Like, it can be difficult when you're submitting similar complaints or recommendations to these agencies time and time again, and you spend lots of time to diligently research an issue or draft something that you think is very convincing, compelling, and should be adopted, just to get your typical response, like, we will take this into consideration, we will launch an investigation, and then never hearing back, or hearing back that they're not going to go forward with whatever you had recommended. So I think it can be difficult to kind of cope with that, and it's kind of important to be persistent and look at the bigger picture. I think Sophie mentioned this as well. Remembering to celebrate the minor victories or the small victories, I think, is super important. They are few and far between. It's difficult to convince people to, one, maybe take you seriously, or adopt what can often be perceived as like radical standpoints in favor of animals. So when you do have a victory, whether it be litigation based or based on some law reform campaign that you've been working on, et cetera, it's important to kind of to recognize that any progress is progress. I think of like an example I can think of is, we were dealing with the Competition Bureau for ads about sustainability of Angus beef burgers, and having them recognize that these ads were in contravention of some of the provisions of the Competition Act, and contacting these organizations to take down these ads or working with them. Albeit minor, it was something nice that we could celebrate as a victory, and it was progress. The last kind of challenge, I guess, is staying creative and engaged. I think we've talked about this pretty extensively across our individual talks and answering the questions, but I think sometimes it can be difficult to find new avenues to kind of attack these same issues. So I think it's important to remain kind of on your toes and think about, how can I approach this differently? And how can I get this end result without working necessarily through this bureaucratic framework that often doesn't serve animals? So again, an example would be like, we're recently granted intervener status in a Supreme Court case, which obviously was high profile, so it was in on people's radars. But thinking about trying to intervene in a public interest standing case and how that could end up benefiting animals, and having our perspective heard, was one of the ways we can kind of look at it from the side rather than head on, to try to advocate for animals, I suppose. So yeah.
Okay, so I have a question for Marty. How can we as law students get involved with animal-friendly legislation?
That's a really good question. I would say some ways to support like legislation actively. One thing is that writing letters to office holders is, people would always wonder, like, will that make a difference? Will somebody get back to me? I would say writing like a very well written, thoughtful letter would normally be noticed. So it can be hard to know who to write to in terms of like what would actually make a difference. But in a federal legislature, for example, a bill would have to pass the Senate and the House of Commons to ultimately make it through. So writing a well-written letter to your local MP, or to party leaders, or to key senators on issues, or key opponents on issues, would make a big difference. And with the whale bill, for example, like, grassroots support made all the difference once the bill was almost defeated, sort of in a closed proceeding. But so many letters got sent in based on Twitter campaigns that it brought down the Senate server and saved the bill. So that's a tangible example of where sort of grassroots efforts have succeeded. And then in a more substantial way, particularly for law students, any of these bills would also go to committee before they would come to votes. So typically with a committee, you'd be totally free to make a written submission actually to the committee itself. And beyond that, helping spread the word on social media, and also like law professors would be very influential people. If one or more law professors supports a bill, so you could certainly talk to your professors and try to see if they have interest in particular legislation, and then the bigger you go, the better. Like, if a letter from a whole faculty or from many students is more compelling than from one. So try to build coalitions and get very serious evidence-based arguments in front of decision makers. And even if it doesn't pay off today, just the fact that people start noticing the public really cares about it, that has a sort of long-term effect on particularly the elected organizations.
That's a great answer. Thank you. So I've organized questions coming in, and then I'll ask our presenters. So keep the questions coming, everyone. So this is for Angela. I am really interested, but this is a question that came in the intersection in food policy as an avenue of animal advocacy. What is the best way to advocate on food policy in particular from the perspective of animals, in your opinion?
Yes, so this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. So it's nice to know that there are other people who are keen on these things as well. I wouldn't even necessarily say that there is a best way to go about doing this. I think that we have covered this expansively in the course of this panel, talking about how there isn't necessarily one easy answer, one silver bullet, or one straightforward mechanism through which to effect change. And a lot of it is also dependent on your skill set and what you bring to the table. Some people are very confident in public speaking and would like to do that kind of thing. Others are more reserved or maybe not as comfortable with that. And so there are so many different ways to get involved in the process, and so many different ways that can really build on your own skill sets and things that you're confident in and enjoy doing. So there's a lot of momentum, I would say, being gained around food law and food policy in general. So again, when I was a law student, this was certainly something that was not on my radar. People didn't talk about food law as its own distinct area, and we are starting to do that a little bit more now. This is basically, like everything that I've been doing for the past few years is at the intersection of the environment and animals and food in many ways. So obviously one way that I've been doing that is through academic research and writing and through my teaching, but dependent on who the question asker is or any of the other students in the audience, there are a lot of different ways to go about that process. And I would say that the first step is probably just making sure that you're educated and informed on the issues and the contemporary debates that are going on, such that you can formulate an opinion that you could then use to help leverage change.
Okay, so this is for Alexandra. How do you prioritize defending activists in a busy criminal law practice?
It's a pretty easy answer. Nobody gets prioritized over anyone else in a criminal law practice, I would say. We're happy to represent any and all activists that come to us, but the same goes for anyone else. So yeah, sometimes that means like you might make sacrifices when it comes to retainer or something, but criminal defense lawyers get pretty used to working on different kinds of retainers anyways. There's, we've managed to kind of be able to represent any activist that comes to us. I think if the issue is prioritizing financially for if somebody's like a sole practitioner or something, you just kind of carve that time out for yourself, I think. And like if you were to go out and do criminal defense on your own and you say, I want to represent activists, I don't want any financial limitations to impact that, then you might have to work extra hard on having many cases going at once so you can make sure to financially afford that. So I hope that answers the question.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so for Scott, what skills did you bring from the private law sector into a nonprofit that you found helpful?
That's a good question. I think I can speak more in broad strokes than anything. I mean, I feel like the biggest thing was kind of managing. Okay, I have 2 points, I guess. First is one of the firm I worked at before. I was lucky enough that it was a full service firm. So I got a lot of exposure, particularly as a summer student and articling student, to kind of overlapping practice areas and different areas of the law, whether that be kind of barrister side, solicitor side, a little bit of litigation, legal research, as well as kind of more formal contract drafting, that kind of stuff. So I think pulling that over to animal law, you're not necessarily in one box, like we've been mentioning. It's you have to be creative with how you work to advocate for animals. So often it involves different areas of the law. You can't just work within one sphere. So I think it was very helpful to have had experience kind of jumping from practice area to practice area, albeit as on a student level, to kind of just understand and be able to pivot from a different piece of legislation to a new piece of legislation, or different kinds of legal drafting, I suppose, like contracts versus kind of memos, and litigation-based drafting, like working on factums, et cetera. So I think it was helpful in that regard. Secondly, and more generally, I think kind of just juggling multiple files or tasks at the same time. I think animal law is a fairly reactive field, so often an incident will happen that can completely derail your day, week, or month. Something can come in through your email that becomes your now #1 priority, but you still have to manage your other files you're working on and ensure that everything's being tended to. I think it was pretty helpful kind of having I don't know, particularly as an articling student again, and as a first year associate, kind of working on multiple files and kind of being able to juggle the expectations. But I guess that is true for basically any area of the law. So take that with a grain of salt. I think you can get that experience elsewhere as well. So yeah, those are the two, I guess, main points, I think.
Okay, and for Sophie, can you elaborate on the adoption of the new provision in the Civil Code of Quebec recognizing animals as sentient beings, and how have you seen it being used since its adoption?
That's a great question. And actually, I'm going to make a quick little advertisement for another panel that I'm speaking on tomorrow morning on environmental rights, the impacts for animals, the implications for animals, in which I'll be going through in a little bit more detail the Civil Code and contrasting that provision with respect to animals, contrasting it with a new development in environmental law that occurred in Quebec recently. But okay, that's the end of my paid advertisement for tomorrow's panel. So yeah, the Animals Are Not Things Manifesto was a campaign created by the Spca, and basically the idea behind it was to ask for a revision of animals' legal status in the Civil Code without really having a specific ask in terms of what that legal status should be, but just the goal being just to trigger a public discussion about what animals should be considered as under the law. And we actually got a lot of public support. It seemed like the ask resonated with a lot of people in Quebec. I mean, pretty much, I think everyone can get behind the idea that an animal shouldn't be treated the same as an inanimate object in the civil law. And so we managed to really get this issue on the agenda at a time where we were having provincial elections. So a new Minister of Agriculture was appointed. And of course, animal protection falls under the Ministry of Agriculture, which is a whole other issue in Quebec, like in several other provinces. And he picked up on this and sort of decided to make it his priority to revise animals' status in the Civil Code. And so what we ended up, to make a long story short, what we ended up having in the Civil Code is a provision that's very similar to what's found in the civil codes of several European countries, such as Switzerland, France, Austria, and Germany, which is a provision that basically says animals are not things, they're sentient beings. But then there's a second paragraph that says, besides the acts that are specifically designed to protect animals, all the laws applicable to property continue to apply to animals nonetheless. So we have a very strange creature in legislative provision, because basically it declares something, but the second paragraph kind of guts most of the significance of that declaration. And there's no other mention of a sentient being in the civil code. So there's no, substantive rights or procedural rights that are attached to that legal status. So animals have this new kind of legal status in Quebec. They're, the legislator says very clearly they're not things, so they're not 100% property, and yet the legislator also says we have to nevertheless continue to treat them as property. So it's a very confusing, it's raised a lot of questions in academic circles as well. And there's actually another panel dealing specifically with this issue. Sorry, I keep advertising panels, but on Sunday morning, there's 4 academics from Quebec that are going to be discussing this provision and what it actually means, because it's gotten a lot of people scratching their heads. But what we've seen in terms of how it's played out in courts on the occasions that it's been invoked. So it was adopted in 2015. It was invoked, a handful of times by litigants, and generally not to much effect because of the second part of the provision that says, laws applicable to property continue to apply to animals despite this new status. So courts have generally refused to, read in any really meaningful protection into this provision. The only sort of tangible changes we've seen is in terms of the amount of damages that people can claim when someone has committed a fault which resulted in either the death or serious injury to a companion animal. Courts have acknowledged that given this new status that animals have in the civil code, the amount of moral damages that someone can claim when they lose a companion animal is more than what it was before the provision was enacted. But that's basically all we've seen in terms of tangible impacts. So, arguably disappointing. However, it is something that, as someone who works on in advocacy, I can tell you it's very useful, because it's a recognition by the legislator in Quebec that animals are not exactly like property, that they have this special quality, they're sentient. And so we can really use this basically to try to convince the government to increase animal protection, whether not necessarily through the civil law, but even in terms of like penal legislation, so our Provincial Animal Welfare Act. It's been a very useful provision in terms of sort of legitimizing efforts to increase animal protection more generally. So yeah, a very good tool to have in our toolbox, even though the tangible impacts are not very impressive.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that explanation. I'm going to, this was a question that came through, but I'm going to ask it to everyone because I think it's really good. What do you think is the #1 way to advance the field of animal law? It's a big question, but I'm very curious to hear your answers. So we'll go in order of speakers again.
I think it's doing what we're already doing, which is having people in all areas of law working on this stuff. We have people doing animal stuff in family courts, criminal courts like my office, in the nonprofit sector, in academia, in the legislature. I think that's what we need. I think that's the way to do this. It's, as I said, like sometimes, I can sit at home and think like, why isn't this criminal court judge agreeing that animals are not property, right? But that's not really the way that change typically happens. Like our job is to ask judges to take animals into account and to reconsider their role in the legal system. But everyone else in other areas of law have to be asking too for it to change, right? So that's what I would say about that.
Thank you. I guess if I was to choose the #1, and speaking to an audience likely to have a lot of animal welfare advocates among it, I would say to go for incremental wins, so incremental progress. I'm thinking, I guess, in the political sphere, but even in litigation or something like this, most progressive movements have succeeded in that way. So you can think of what your dream for animal laws to look like maybe in the future, but you're unlikely to get there without 50 things happening in between. So start at number 50, then do number 49. So with a piece of legislation is much more likely to succeed if it's very targeted. And then a couple other related tips in going for these incremental wins would be to advocate, again, through science, whatever it may be in whatever animal area. And I would just also note Senator Sinclair talked about a political alliance, around the subjects of animal welfare, environmental protection, and Indigenous rights. So always be looking to build a coalition and don't get hung up on issues that are divisive within the animal welfare community. Try to go for things that you don't have to agree on everything to agree on something. So try to go on things that are more likely to have consensus and that are sort of attainable and that you can build from. Thanks.
So there are obviously multiple ways that you can affect change in animal law and in the animal space in the course of your professional life and your career. But I would also say to not discredit or devalue the amount of good that you can also do in a personal capacity and the choices that you make on a daily basis that can also meaningfully alleviate suffering for animals and help spread changes within the population more broadly. So I feel like many of you are probably aware of the fact that vegans generally do not have a good reputation. People think of vegans as being strident, as being overly moralistic. And so I think that even when we talk about things like our dietary choices, the ways in which we talk about them and the ways that we understand how people will receive them can also make meaningful differences as well. So I have an RA, I hired him for the summer. And it was funny because in one of the conversations that we had, he was kind of jokingly saying that he loves his meat and I'm never going to get him to give up his meat. And to which my response was, I'm not trying to, that has nothing to do with the tone of the conversation was joking. It wasn't an adversarial conversation, but by the end of the summer, he was actually like, oh, being vegan or being vegetarian actually isn't as difficult as I imagined. And so I think that's just kind of framing it in a more positive light and encouraging people to try things that maybe they haven't tried before and to kind of get out of their assumptions about what being vegan or vegetarian is or about any other aspects of animal advocacy in your personal day-to-day life can be helpful as well.
I would say that the number one way is really you guys, so law students, the next generation of lawyers, because I think no matter how hard us panelists and others in our field work, we need our ideas and our arguments to resonate with other people in positions of power, other lawyers, judges, politicians, and so for me, it's really key to sort of sensitize the next generation to these issues to make sure that that the next generation will be responsive to them.
Yeah, I echo everybody's points up until this point. I think those are all very important ways to advance the field of animal law. And I think my number one way, if I had to pick one, would be continuing to work with cooperation and in coalitions with several interested parties, whether that be enforcement agencies who you typically would disagree with their methods, whether that be animal advocacy groups, academics, politicians. I think it's important to kind of build these relationships and continue to build the network, because I think the more people who are attuned to these issues, obviously the more recognition they'll get, and the more bright people thinking about one thing is always for the best. So I think, yeah, continued involvement and continued cooperation, trying to find new ways, new avenues to kind of tackle these big issues, which seem very daunting right now.
Okay, so I have another question for Marty. Can you describe the genesis of the Jane Goodall Act and how it has been progressing?
Sure, I would be happy to. So Senator Sinclair when Senator Moore retired, so Senator Moore initiated the whale bill, and when he retired for mandatory retirement age, Senator Sinclair took over the whale bill. And for probably the majority of the time it took to pass the whale bill, Senator Sinclair was the sponsor. So the sponsor is like the sort of leading champion or advocate of the bill, and they have certain procedural rights attached to it. So after the whale bill passed, Senator Sinclair is interested to do, a follow-up. It's a significant statutory precedent to created a new animal cruelty criminal offense and also a new framework in international trade laws that recognized the individual interests of animals, which was a big precedent. So he wanted to do something to follow up on it. And Jane Goodall had in 2019 called for a ban on elephant ivory and hunting trophies. So that was out there as a policy proposal. And then sort of in the philosophical and scientific literature, elephants and great apes are often considered to have many characteristics in common with whales and dolphins, like for example, self-awareness, complicated social lives, complicated emotional lives. So in a way, those animals are more similar to whales and dolphins, and in a way similar to us. So it's not a huge leap to, particularly great apes, you could say. So it's not a huge leap to think that they should at least have legal protection. Not to say other animals shouldn't, but that's an easy starting point. If a great ape has 98+% of our DNA, it shouldn't seem like a huge onerous requirement to require a license and a good reason to have a chimpanzee. It seems almost wild that you wouldn't have any type of restriction around that. And then elephant captivity has been a live issue in Canada for some time. The Toronto Zoo and the Calgary Zoo both relocated their elephants to the United States. So that plays into elephants as an issue. And then it's so difficult to pass the whale bill that the thought being there should be some way to expand the law without having to go back to the legislature every time. So there would be this measure to be able to add additional animals. Big cats are the example Senator Sinclair has focused on, and a lot of people will be familiar with Tiger King and the wide amount of negative treatment of these animals and exploitive treatment. And also the province of BC, and I think PEI have already banned that. So there's sort of a lot of precedents that build towards this. And Senator Sinclair asked Dr. Goodall if he could name it in her honor, and she was enthusiastic about that. And I guess that's the genesis of the bill. But I'm taking up a lot of time, but a quick update would be that elements of it were in the Liberal election platform. It would seem to open up the possibility of government legislation or government support, which is very significant in terms of the prospects of it passing. Government matters get a much higher priority in Parliament than a private member's bill. And Senator Klein plans to reintroduce the bill as when Parliament resumes. There may be some developments in terms of the policy details. It's a much more substantial and a bit complex bill compared to the whale bill, but basically it will be going again this Parliament, and there's lots of things going for it in the favor, includes crossover with government policy and Environment Canada's consultations on the ivory ban. Thank you.
That's great to hear. I think we can sneak one more quick question in, and then we will have to wrap up. So this was for Sophie. You mentioned the issue of animal advocacy being slow moving in the law. How do you maintain your passion and drive in the face of laws being slow to change?
Thanks for the question. Honestly, it's something I struggle with. I find it hard to stay optimistic sometimes. But I mean, there are two things that help me. One, like Scott was mentioning, celebrate the small victories, and even if they seem small, celebrate the bleep out of them. So definitely that's important. And second, well, I'm lucky enough to work at an organization where we shelter animals. And so I know not everyone has the chance to do this, but I draw a lot of strength and come from actually having contact with the animals that I work for. And, you know, I have my companion animals at home, but also seeing at the SPCA sort of, you know, animals that we're able to help, and realizing that, you know, for those animals, you know, for me, it's, you know, one animal that I'm helping out of hundreds of millions that I'd like to help, but for that one animal, it makes the world of a difference. So that helps me a lot.
I think that's a good note to end on. So I want to say thank you to our speakers for attending today. We really appreciate hearing your insights, and tune in to the next panel after the break. To all of the students who are attending, the student scholarship panel is next. Thanks so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.